Well, hi there, and welcome to episode 15 of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I'm really excited about this episode because I know a lot of you are struggling with joining in the round, and specifically where you should start and where you should end your rounds. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get to it though, I would love for you to subscribe to the show. My sole purpose here is to help you get better at your craft, whether that be knitting or crochet, and hopefully sometimes both. And by subscribing to the show, I'll know that you have access to every single video I publish, and we can hang out every single week. All right, let's break it down really plain and simple. When you're crocheting a circle, a flat piece, there's a couple different ways that you can do that. You can either work in a spiral, what they call it, and that's where you aren't joining, or you can join at the end of the round. Now, if you're following a pattern, it will tell you specifically what you need to do. If you're not supposed to join, it'll say to work in a spiral. It might even say don't join, continue to next round. Or if you're working on a pattern and they do want you to join at the end of that round, they'll specifically say that somewhere within your pattern. If you're sort of flying solo and you're making up something as you go, and you might be wondering, well, I don't know if I should do a spiral or join, what would you recommend? Well, for me, I like to work in spirals when I'm doing shorter stitches, so single crochet specifically, and especially when I'm working on amigurumi or little stuffed animals. I might also work in a spiral when I'm using multiple colors. So for example, if I'm doing a striped pattern and I'm changing the yarn every single row, I like to work in a spiral there so you don't see any clear joins at the back side of that work. It just sort of looks like a spiral. You're changing colors as you go. Now we'll specifically look at examples here where you are joining with a slip stitch, because I think that's where you're getting tripped up as far as not knowing what your first stitch is and what your last stitch is. All right, so let's break down this demonstration into two sections. First, we'll look at what to do for your first stitch, and then we'll look at what to do at the very end of that round. So that'll help you determine what your first stitch is and what your last stitch is, and where you should join with that slip stitch.
All right, now in this example, I'm working with double crochet stitches, and I have a turning chain of 3. In this example, our turning chain will count as our first stitch. Now you want to pay close attention to your pattern. There could be some variation here as far as whether or not you should make your increase in the first stitch or not. So here I'm starting on my second round, which just as a general rule for crocheting in the round, we're always going to increase every single stitch on round 2. So I like to use my 3 chains as a double crochet, but I will pair it up at the end. Because I have my join right here in my chain 3, this is going to be my first stitch that I will work. Now technically, yes, I'm counting that as a stitch, but I like to use this as my last stitch. A little bit different. So I will work my hook in that next stitch over, work my double crochet, and I will increase, so I'm making 2 there. So with this method, I am making this my first stitch of the round. My chain 3 will be my last stitch of the round. So let me work through the rest of this round. All right, so from here I've made it to the end of my round. Because my chain 3 is my last stitch of the round, I need to make 1 more double crochet right there with that chain 3, and that's only for round 2 because I am increasing every stitch. Now from here I will join with a slip stitch to my 3rd chain. So just pop your hook right in there and slip stitch. Now the reason why I like using this method is because see how it's nice and closed in? There's no gap there in between the chain 3 and the next stitch, and you would experience that if you used your chain 3 as your first stitch instead of your last stitch. So just a little ninja trick I've picked up over the years. I tend to do things this way, even if my pattern doesn't tell me to. Now when you're working in a tube, this is much more straightforward. You can actually just memorize this. So I'm working with double crochets again. I have my chain 3 as my turning chain, and this will count as my first stitch. So this is my first double crochet of the second round that I'm working, and I will just look over and find that next post. Now if you turn it up, you can see the V, and it's a little bit distorted because of the slip stitch from that previous join, but all you need to do is work your first stitch in that post. So continue with your stitch pattern repeat, and then I will show you where your last stitch is. All right, now as you're looking for that last stitch, you'll want to pay close attention to the previous row. You can tell a difference between your double crochet stitch and your turning chain. They look a little bit different. I know that my chain 3 is my first stitch of the round, and so I'll just look over from there to find that last post. So that tells me it's my last stitch of this round as well. Now here is one thing I know causes a lot of drama, and that's this little guy next to your chain 3. If you were to add a stitch here, then you're increasing. You're increasing by 1 stitch, and you may not really notice it on this particular round, but if you do it consistently, as you move up your pattern, it's going to get bigger and bigger. So your tube will be small down here at the bottom, and it'll fan out and get a little bit bigger. So if you experience that in your project, that's what you're doing wrong. You're adding a stitch at the end of the round. Instead, we're going to ignore this completely. And by the way, this looks the same even if you're working in a half double crochet, a treble crochet, it doesn't matter what stitch, you're always going to see this little guy, this little V here, coming from your turning chain. So instead, you'll just ignore it, find that third chain, join with a slip stitch there, and then it pulls it all together. I was always tempted to work there because I didn't want there to be a gap. But when you slip stitch it to that third chain, it pulls everything together and there isn't a gap.
Now from that demonstration, you hopefully pulled 3 really important things away from that. First thing being that counting is your best friend. I know it's not always fun and it's tedious, especially if you have a lot of stitches, but counting is really the only way you can be sure that you're not making a mistake. The second thing is that stitch markers are also your friend. They can be put anywhere really, and if you know that you consistently are missing the last stitch every single round, well then maybe you mark that last stitch so that you don't miss it the next time around. And lastly, your pattern will give you every bit of information, so follow it step by step. Even if you think you're getting to the point where you're memorizing it, it's always good to just follow the pattern, even if you already know what it's going to say, because you never know, it could throw you for a loop. Another really important takeaway is to always understand the turning chain and its role within the specific pattern. Turning chains can be a little bit weird because sometimes they count as stitches and sometimes they don't, and it's really up to the designer, leaving you to not really ever know what to do exactly. Again, your pattern is going to be your best friend, so if you are wondering whether or not your turning chain counts as a stitch, always refer to your pattern. It'll say it somewhere in the pattern notes, and sometimes you'll see it specifically for each of the rows. Now, if you are writing the pattern for yourself, well then the sky's the limit. If you want your turning chain to count as a stitch, then you count it as a stitch. But if you don't, then you don't. The most important thing to take away from this is that your turning chain is either your first stitch of that round or it's not. And knowing whether or not it's your first stitch will tell you where you need to work that very next stitch. It'll tell you what to do next, and it'll also tell you where and how to join at the end of that round. All right, so that'll wrap it up for this episode of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you have any other questions as it relates to crocheting in the round and these joining techniques and perhaps even the first and last stitch, leave those in the comments section. I would love to elaborate on this topic a little bit more if it's something that will help you, so let me know. Also, if you have another crochet or knit related question to something you're struggling with, leave that in the comments section as well. I curate B.Hooked TV episodes based on your feedback, and I can make sure I'm providing you with a video that actually matters to you. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the show if you haven't done so already. That way we can hang out again next week. I'll see you then.